The first thing she did was change the locks. I stood on my own porch, holding grocery bags, watching Melissa open the door just enough to look at me with cold detachment. Her mother stood behind her, arms crossed like a silent enforcer. Melissa didn't cry, didn't hesitate. She just said it plainly, like she was reading from a script. "Everything here belongs to me now, Marcus. You need to leave." Then she handed me a thick envelope. Divorce papers. While I stood there frozen, she shut the door in my face. The deadbolt sliding into place echoed in the sudden silence. All my belongings were still inside. My clothes, my laptop, family photos, everything trapped behind a door that used to be mine. I stood there in shock, realizing I had just been erased from my own life. But what hurt more than losing the house wasn't the property itself. It was how easily she said it, how confident she looked, how completely prepared she seemed, like she'd been planning it for months while I lived in blissful ignorance, and how her mother watched with satisfaction, like this was justice being served instead of betrayal being executed. I slept in my car that night, parked 2 blocks away where I could still see the house through the trees. The house I had spent 6 years paying for. Every mortgage payment had come from my account. Every repair, every improvement. I'd built that life from nothing, while Melissa hadn't worked in 3 years. Her mother had convinced her she deserved security. I'd supported that decision. Believed we were building something together. Now I sat in a cramped sedan, staring at windows that used to welcome me home. My phone buzzed around midnight. A text from Melissa. "Don't come back. It's over." No explanation, no acknowledgement of 6 years together, no apology, just cold efficiency. I read it 3 times, searching for some hint of the woman I'd married, the one who'd cried at our wedding, who'd promised forever. That woman was gone, replaced by someone I didn't recognize, someone who could lock me out of my own life without hesitation. But something about her confidence felt rehearsed, too certain, like she knew something I didn't. 2 days later, she agreed to meet me at a cafe. I arrived early, desperate to understand. Melissa showed up late with her mother and a lawyer, a tall man in an expensive suit carrying a briefcase. They sat across from me like a tribunal. Melissa wouldn't look at me when she spoke, just stared past my shoulder, her voice emotionless. "You signed everything over, Marcus. The house is in my name, legally, officially, completely." My stomach dropped. I didn't remember signing anything like that. When did I sign anything? Her lawyer, Harrison, slid a photocopy across the table. 3 months ago. This document transfers full ownership of the property at 847 Maple Drive to Melissa Ann Foster. Your signature is clearly visible here. I stared at the paper. It looked official. Legal letterhead, notary stamp, and there at the bottom was my signature, my actual signature, authentic looking, transferring complete ownership to my wife, but I didn't remember signing it, didn't remember any such conversation. "I never signed this," I said quietly. Melissa finally looked at me, pure contempt in her eyes. "Yes, you did. You just don't want to admit it now." I took the photocopy with shaking hands. The signature really did look like mine. The loops matched. The way I crossed my T's, it looked legitimate, real, binding. Melissa smirked like she'd already won. Her mother squeezed her shoulder proudly. Harrison watched with professional detachment. I felt sick. Had I been that careless? Had I really signed away everything without reading it? Had I trusted Melissa so completely that I'd destroyed my own future? The cafe felt too small, too hot. Then my eyes caught on a detail, the date at the top of the document, March 17th. I stared at it, my mind racing. March 17th. Why did that date stand out? Then it hit me. March 17th was a day I wasn't even in the country. I'd been in Toronto for a work conference, 3 days, March 16th through 18th. I had flight records, hotel confirmations, conference attendance records, photos with timestamps. It was impossible for me to have signed anything in our city on March 17th. I looked up at Melissa, at Harrison, at her mother who sat there so confident. They had no idea what I'd just realized. Either I had lost my mind completely or someone had forged my signature. That date haunted me. I went straight to my storage unit and dug through boxes, found my passport, flipped through the stamps. There it was. Entry into Canada on March 16th. Return on March 18th. I pulled out my old calendar. March 17th was clearly marked. Toronto Conference, Day 2. I had email confirmations, flight boarding passes, hotel receipts, photos from the conference with timestamps showing March 17th, 2:34 p.m. The exact time the document claimed I'd signed it in a notary's office 3 hours away from Toronto. Impossible. Physically impossible. Yet Melissa and her lawyer had spoken with absolute certainty, had presented the document like it was indisputable fact. I checked my records 3 more times, but no, the evidence was clear. I was in another country when that signature was supposedly witnessed. Either someone had forged my name, or Melissa had created an entire false document. My hands trembled as I photographed every piece of evidence: the passport stamps, the flight confirmations, the hotel receipt, the conference photos, because this wasn't just about property anymore. This was fraud, deliberate, calculated, criminal. I started remembering things differently. About 6 months ago, Melissa had asked me to sign a stack of papers. Just tax forms, she'd said dismissively. The accountant needs them. I'd been busy, stressed, tired. I trusted her completely, so I'd signed where she pointed without reading carefully. Never imagined she'd hide something destructive. Her mother had always said I was too trusting, had called it my biggest flaw. Marcus just believes whatever anyone tells him, she'd said once, laughing like it was endearing instead of insulting. Maybe she was right. Maybe trust did make me weak. But trust shouldn't make you vulnerable to the person who promised to love you. Trust shouldn't be a weapon someone uses to destroy you. I'd trusted Melissa with everything: my finances, my future, my heart. And she'd used that trust to systematically dismantle my life, piece by piece, document by document, lie by lie, until she could lock me out and tell me everything belonged to her, with confidence, with certainty, with her mother's full support, because she'd built this trap carefully, methodically, while I was too busy being a good husband to notice the walls closing in. The next day, I checked my bank account. What I found made me physically ill. My savings account was nearly empty. $47,000 gone, transferred out in multiple transactions over 3 weeks. My emergency fund reduced to less than $3,000. The funds had been moved to a joint account Melissa and I had opened years ago but barely used, an account Melissa had full access to. Every transfer had been initiated from her login. While I'd been going to work, thinking our marriage was fine, she'd been quietly draining my financial security, not in one obvious theft, but in calculated increments. $4,000 here, $6,000 there. Amounts large enough to add up, but small enough not to. Trigger warnings. The last transfer had happened 2 days before she locked me out, the day before she served me with divorce papers. She hadn't just taken the house, she had taken my safety net, my ability to fight back, my resources to hire lawyers or find a place to stay. She'd left me with almost nothing, homeless, broke, confused, exactly where she wanted me, powerless to challenge her, too destroyed to fight. It was brilliant in a horrible way. She'd thought of everything. A week later, a mutual friend sent me a photo. He didn't realize what it meant, just thought I'd want to know Melissa was doing okay. The image made my blood run cold. Melissa and her mother at an upscale restaurant, champagne glasses raised, both smiling, genuinely smiling, relaxed, victorious. The caption, saw Melissa and her mom celebrating something. Celebrating, not grieving a failed marriage, not mourning 6 years together, not sad about what we'd lost. They were celebrating what they'd gained, the champagne, the expensive restaurant, the satisfied expressions. This wasn't the behavior of someone going through an emotionally difficult divorce. This was a victory lap. Melissa wasn't sad our marriage had ended. She was thrilled with how it had ended, with what she'd managed to take from it. And her mother was right there, raising a glass to their success. I stared at that photo for an hour. This wasn't emotional. This wasn't about love turning to resentment. This was strategic, planned, executed with precision. They hadn't just stolen my property and money. They'd been working together to orchestrate the whole thing, and they were proud of themselves. Celebrating while I slept in my car. My older brother Daniel lived 3 hours away. I'd been avoiding calling him, too ashamed to admit what had happened, but I was running out of options. So I drove to his house one Saturday and told him everything. He listened without interrupting, just listened with analytical focus. When I finished, he sat quietly. Then he asked a question I wasn't expecting. Did you ever inherit anything before you married Melissa? The question caught me off guard. What? Why does that matter? Just answer. Did you inherit money, property, anything before the marriage? I started to say no. Then I froze. There was one thing, something I'd almost forgotten. 3 years before I married her, my grandfather had died. He'd left me something. Not money, but land. A quarter-acre lot on the edge of town. Undeveloped, just empty land that had been in our family for generations. I'd used that inheritance as collateral to get the construction loan for our house, had built on that inherited land. The house Melissa claimed now belonged entirely to her, but the land underneath it, the foundation, the property itself, that had started with me, with my grandfather's gift, before Melissa, before our marriage, and that distinction might matter, might change everything. I explained it to Daniel carefully. My grandfather had been a simple man, a mechanic who'd bought that quarter acre in the 1970s, hoping to build a retirement home. He never did. When he died, he left the land to me, his oldest grandson. I'd been 24, just starting my career. The land had seemed like a nice gesture, but not particularly valuable. Then I'd met Melissa. We'd started dating, got engaged. And when we talked about building a life together, I'd suggested using my inherited land to build a house. It saved us from having to buy property, made the construction loan manageable. Melissa had been excited, happy to have a foundation to build on. But she'd never really focused on the ownership details, never paid attention to the legal specifics. She'd always thought of it as our house, built together, owned together. But legally, the land itself had never been ours. The land had been mine, inherited before marriage, my separate property. The house built on top was joint marital property, but the foundation, the ground beneath, the actual parcel of land that had started with me. And if I was remembering correctly, my grandfather had put specific conditions on that inheritance, protections, clauses, things his lawyer had insisted on, things I'd signed but barely understood at 24 years old, things Melissa might not know about, things that might invalidate her claim. I drove to my storage unit, the place where I'd kept old documents and family records. I needed the original deed papers from my grandfather's estate, the inheritance documents. But when I got there and started digging, my heart sank. They weren't where I remembered putting them. I'd had a file labeled property documents, original deeds, title records, estate papers, everything related to the land inheritance. It was gone, missing. I tore through every box, checked folders, looked everywhere, but they were gone. Melissa had access to this storage unit. I'd given her a key years ago. We'd used it together. She could have come here anytime, could have taken whatever she wanted. And apparently she had. My heart pounded. She hadn't just planned for divorce. She had planned for complete ownership, had removed any evidence that might contradict her claim, had systematically eliminated my ability to prove the inheritance existed. This wasn't opportunistic. This was premeditated. Months of planning, months of quietly removing obstacles, months of building an airtight case while I trusted her. She'd thought of everything. Every possible defense I might have, every document I might need, and she'd taken them, or so she thought. I found a property lawyer through Daniel's recommendation. Patricia Harris, specialized in real estate disputes and fraud cases. I showed up with everything I had, the forged transfer document, my passport proving I was out of the country, the bank records showing drained accounts. Patricia reviewed everything carefully. When she got to the transfer document, she spent a long time examining it, pulled out a magnifying glass, made notes. Then her expression shifted. "This isn't complete," she said. "What do you mean?" "This transfer document references the property at 847 Maple Drive, but it doesn't reference the original title chain, doesn't acknowledge the land's provenance or any prior ownership structures." She looked up. "Did you inherit this property or the land it's on?" "The land," I confirmed. "Before I married Melissa." Patricia's eyes sharpened. "Then this document is fundamentally flawed. You can't transfer ownership of property built on inherited land without addressing the inheritance structure. There are legal requirements." She pulled up something on her computer. "And if your grandfather put any protective clauses in the original inheritance." "What kind of protective clauses?" I asked. "Restrictions on transfer, requirements for family approval. Anything that would limit what you could do with the land without meeting certain conditions. I tried to remember. There was something. I remember signing papers at the lawyer's office, my grandfather's lawyer. He explained things, but I was young and didn't really understand. "We need to find those original documents," Patricia said. Patricia made calls, started tracking down records. My grandfather's estate had been handled by a lawyer named Theodore Brennan. He'd retired 5 years ago, but his practice had been absorbed by a larger firm. They had archives. Everything was digitized. It took 3 days, 3 days of waiting, hoping. Then Patricia called. "Marcus, I found it, the original inheritance deed, and you need to see this clause." I drove to her office immediately. She had the document printed, highlighted sections marked in yellow. "Your grandfather inserted a comprehensive protective clause. The land can only be transferred or sold if 3 conditions are met. First, written approval from at least 2 direct descendants. Second, verification that the transfer doesn't violate the family's historical claim. Third, explicit acknowledgement of the inheritance chain in any transfer documents." She looked up. "Melissa's transfer document doesn't mention any of this, doesn't acknowledge the inheritance, doesn't get the required approvals." "So what does that mean?" I asked. "It means her transfer is invalid, incomplete. She can claim ownership of the house structure, maybe, but the land itself, the foundation, the actual property, that's still protected by your grandfather's clause." Patricia smiled grimly. "And you can't own a house without the land it sits on. Her claim isn't complete, it's legally fragile, and we can challenge it." For the first time in weeks, I felt hope, real hope. Melissa had overlooked one critical detail. The very foundation of her victory was built on sand. Suddenly, Melissa's urgency made perfect sense. The rushed divorce papers, the immediate lockout, the confident assertions. She wasn't confident because she was right. She was confident because she hoped I wouldn't look deeper, that I'd be too devastated to investigate, too confused to question. Her power depended on my silence, on my assumption that she was telling the truth, on my acceptance of defeat. She needed me to give up quickly, to walk away without fighting, because if I dug deeper, if I found the original inheritance documents, if I discovered the protective clause, her entire claim would unravel, the forged signature, the missing documents from my storage, the drained bank accounts, the celebration dinner. It was all designed to overwhelm me, to make me feel powerless, to convince me that fighting back was futile. But it was also evidence of desperation. If her claim was truly solid, why forge my signature? Why steal the original documents? Why rush everything? The answer was clear, because she knew her claim had weaknesses, knew the inheritance complicated things. So she'd tried to end it before I could fight, tried to crush me completely before I could stand up, tried to win through speed and overwhelming force. But she'd made a mistake. She'd underestimated how much I'd be willing to fight for the truth, how determined I'd become once I realized the scope of her betrayal. And that mistake was going to cost her everything she thought she'd won. Patricia filed our legal response, a formal challenge to Melissa's ownership claim, asserting my rights based on the inherited land and the protective clause, requesting a full review of the transfer document. Melissa received the notice 2 days later. My phone rang within an hour. Her voice was sharp, furious. "What do you think you're doing, Marcus? This is harassment. The house is mine. The transfer is legal. You signed it. Just accept reality." But her voice wasn't calm anymore, wasn't smooth or confident. There was an edge to it, a nervousness she couldn't hide. "I was in Toronto on March 17th, I said quietly. "The day that document claims I signed it. I have passport stamps, flight records, hotel receipts, time-stamped photos. I was in another country, Melissa." Silence, long and heavy. "You're lying," she finally said, but her voice was weak. "Am I?" I asked. "Or did you forge my signature and hope I wouldn't notice?" She hung up without responding, but I heard what I needed to hear. The panic, the uncertainty, the realization that her perfect plan wasn't so perfect, that I wasn't going to quietly disappear, that I was going to fight. For the first time since this nightmare began, the power dynamic had shifted. She was the one on the defensive now, the one scrambling to maintain control, the one afraid of what I might uncover next. The calls became more frequent, more desperate. Melissa's composure was cracking. Her mother started calling too, her her voice dripping with contempt. "You're pathetic, Marcus, harassing a woman going through a difficult divorce. Can't you just accept that it's over? That you lost?" The words were meant to hurt, to shame, to make me back down. But anger doesn't come from certainty. Anger comes from fear. If they were truly confident, they wouldn't be calling, wouldn't be threatening, wouldn't be trying so hard to make me give up. They just let the legal process unfold and trust in their documents. But they weren't doing that. They were panicking, which meant they knew something was wrong, knew their claim had weaknesses, knew I'd found something that threatened their victory. "You'll regret this," Melissa's mother said. "You'll lose everything and look like a fool." "I want the truth," I replied calmly, "and I'm going to prove it." She hung up with insults I didn't bother listening to. Because none of it mattered. Their anger, their threats, their attempts to make me feel worthless. What mattered was evidence. Documents, legal facts. And in that arena, I was no longer powerless. I had the inheritance deed. I had proof of the protective clause. I had my alibi for the forged signature. And I had a lawyer who believed me. They could be as angry as they wanted. But anger doesn't win legal battles. Truth does. 2 weeks after we filed our challenge, Patricia received an unusual call. Harrison wanted to speak with her privately. Attorney to attorney. Off the record. Patricia called me afterward. Harrison didn't know about the inheritance clause. Melissa never told him about your grandfather's land. She presented everything as if you'd bought the property together during the marriage. "So he didn't know the foundation was problematic?" I asked. "No. And now that we've brought the inheritance deed to light, he's realized his client hasn't been entirely honest. He's concerned." I felt grim satisfaction. "What did he say?" "He asked if we'd be willing to negotiate, suggested maybe there was room for compromise." Patricia paused. "He's trying to find a way out for Melissa that doesn't involve admitting she committed fraud." "What did you tell him?" "I told him we're not interested in compromise. We're interested in legal facts. And the facts show that Melissa's claim to complete ownership is invalid, that the transfer document is incomplete at best, forged at worst." I could hear the smile in her voice. He wasn't happy, but he wasn't arguing anymore either. He knows the foundation of his case just collapsed. Melissa's lawyer now knew he'd been deceived by his own client, that the woman he was representing had given him incomplete information and hoped he wouldn't discover the truth, and that his professional reputation was now tied to a fraudulent claim. A week later, I returned to the house with Patricia, not to break in, just to formally assert my legal rights as the legitimate owner of the land the property sat on. Patricia had filed notice. Everything was official. Melissa opened the door, her face tight with fury. She'd been expecting capitulation. Instead, she received resistance, organization, legal precision. And for the first time since she'd locked me out, she wasn't in complete control. "You need to leave," she said. "This is my property." "Actually," Patricia replied calmly, "the property ownership is currently in dispute. My client has legal claims that predate your marriage and supersede the transfer document you've presented." Melissa's mother appeared behind her, face twisted with rage. "This is harassment. We'll call the police." "Please do," Patricia said smoothly. "I'm sure they'll be very interested in the forged transfer document and the fact that Marcus was provably out of the country when he supposedly signed it." The color drained from both their faces. They hadn't expected that. Hadn't expected me to have proof. Harrison appeared behind them, looking tired and frustrated. "Let's all calm down," he said. "This is a legal matter that should be handled through proper channels." But his voice lacked conviction. He knew he was representing a losing position. Patricia pulled out the original inheritance deed, laid it on the table by the door where everyone could see it. "This is the original property deed," she said clearly, "dated 8 years ago, 3 years before Marcus and Melissa's marriage. It transfers ownership of the land at 847 Maple Drive from Marcus's grandfather to Marcus personally, with specific protective clauses preventing transfer without family approval and proper legal acknowledgement of the inheritance chain." She looked at Melissa directly. "Your transfer document mentions none of this. It treats the property as if it was purchased jointly during the marriage, which is factually incorrect. The land was inherited before the marriage, making it separate property, and your attempted transfer violates multiple provisions of the protective clause. Melissa's confidence collapsed instantly, visibly, completely. Her face went from angry defiance to shocked recognition. She'd thought she'd covered everything, thought she'd removed all the evidence. But digital archives don't disappear. Law firm records don't vanish, and protective clauses don't expire just because someone hopes they don't exist. Her mother stopped speaking, stopped threatening, just stood there, finally understanding that their perfect plan had a fatal flaw. They'd built their strategy on the assumption I wouldn't discover the inheritance protection, that I'd be too defeated to investigate thoroughly. They'd been wrong. Harrison took the deed and read it carefully, his expression growing darker with each paragraph. He'd been deceived, and now he was holding proof of that deception in his hands. Harrison set the document down carefully and looked at Melissa with barely disguised frustration. "We need to talk," he said to her. "Privately, now." Melissa tried to maintain composure, but I could see the panic building. "This doesn't change anything," she insisted. "The house is still in my name. The transfer is still valid." "Actually," Patricia interjected, "the transfer is incomplete and therefore invalid. You can't transfer ownership of a house built on inherited land without addressing the inheritance structure. And you certainly can't do it with a forged signature on a date when the supposed signatory was in another country." She pulled out copies of my passport, flight records, and time-stamped photos. "Marcus was in Toronto on March 17th. We have irrefutable proof, which means this signature was either forged or the document is fraudulent. Either way, it's not legally binding." Harrison's face had gone completely neutral. The face of a lawyer realizing his client had lied to him. "We need to discuss our options," he said to Melissa. His tone made it clear those options weren't good. Melissa's mother tried one more time. "This is just a technicality. The house was built during the marriage. That makes it marital property." "The house was built on separate property," Patricia cut her off. "Property that belonged to Marcus before the marriage and is protected by legal clauses that prevent unauthorized transfer. Your daughter's claim to complete ownership isn't just weak, it's legally unsustainable." The truth was out. The foundation of Melissa's victory had crumbled, and everyone in that doorway knew it. Over the next week, Melissa's anger transformed into panic, desperation. She called me repeatedly, her voice losing its edge of certainty with each conversation. "You're twisting everything," she accused, "making it seem like I planned this. It was just a misunderstanding." "You forged my signature," I said flatly. "You drained my bank accounts. You stole the original documents from my storage unit. That's not a misunderstanding. That's fraud. I didn't." She couldn't finish her sentences anymore. The smooth confidence was gone. Now she was just a person facing consequences she hadn't prepared for. "You thought you could erase me," I said quietly. "Take everything I built, and I'd just accept it because you said so." "Marcus, please, we can work this out. You can have the house. Just drop the fraud allegations. Please." But it wasn't about the house anymore. It wasn't about the property or the money. It was about the truth. About exposing what she'd done. About making sure she faced consequences for systematically destroying my life. "Facts don't care about your panic, Melissa," I said. "You made choices, deliberate choices, to forge, to steal, to manipulate. Now you deal with the consequences." She hung up, and I knew the call wasn't about reconciliation. It was about fear. Fear that everything she'd tried to take was slipping away. Fear that her shortcuts were backfiring. And fear, unlike confidence, couldn't be faked. The woman who had once spoken with absolute authority now spoke carefully, cautiously. Harrison stopped returning Patricia's calls, which meant he'd probably withdrawn or was advising Melissa to settle immediately. Her mother stopped calling me entirely. Melissa's social media, which had been filled with subtle jabs about new beginnings, went quiet. No more celebration posts, no more champagne photos. Her power had depended entirely on intimidation, on making me believe her version of reality through sheer confidence. Without that, she was just another person who'd committed fraud and was about to face the legal system. She couldn't erase me anymore, couldn't make me disappear with a forged document, couldn't lock me out of my own life just because she wanted to. The balance had shifted completely. I wasn't the powerless victim sleeping in his car anymore. I was the rightful owner of inherited property with legal documentation proving my claim, and she was the person who'd tried to steal it through forgery and manipulation. When Patricia filed our final brief with all evidence attached, Melissa's remaining lawyer sent a settlement offer the same day. They wanted to negotiate, wanted to compromise, because they knew what a trial would reveal. Not just that Melissa's claim was invalid, but that she'd committed multiple crimes trying to enforce it. The court hearing was scheduled for a Friday morning. 6 weeks after Melissa had first locked me out, Patricia presented our evidence methodically: the inheritance deed, the protective clause, my alibi for the forged signature, the bank records, the missing original documents, the timeline of Melissa's actions. The judge, Judge Martinez, reviewed everything carefully, asked pointed questions about the forged transfer document, questioned Harrison about his client's knowledge of the inheritance, examined my passport stamps personally. When she was done, she looked at Melissa directly. "Mrs. Foster, did you know about your husband's inherited land when you filed the ownership transfer?" Melissa's new lawyer tried to answer for her, but the judge cut him off. "I'm asking your client directly." Melissa's voice was barely audible. I knew the land came from his grandfather." "Did you know about the protective clauses preventing unauthorized transfer?" I wasn't sure." "Did you forge your husband's signature on the transfer document?" Silence. Long and damning. "Mrs. Foster, I asked you a direct question." "I didn't think it mattered," Melissa finally whispered. "Didn't think what mattered? The signature? The inheritance? The legal protections?" Judge Martinez's voice was hard, because all of those things matter very much in a court of law. 3 days later, the court issued its decision. The attempted ownership transfer was declared invalid. My legal rights to the inherited property were affirmed, and the court referred the matter of the forged signature to the district attorney for criminal investigation. When Melissa moved out 2 weeks later, she didn't look at me, wouldn't meet my eyes as movers carried boxes to a truck. Her mother was there helping, but she avoided me entirely. No more threats, no more confidence, just quiet defeat. The house stood exactly as it had before. Same walls, same rooms, same foundation built on land my grandfather had left me. But everything was different. Not because I'd won a legal battle, not because I'd proven fraud, but because I finally understood my own worth. Understood that I didn't have to accept someone else's version of my reality. That I could fight back even when everything seemed lost. That the truth, when backed by evidence and determination, was more powerful than lies backed by confidence. I stood in the living room I'd built, looked at the walls I'd painted, the floors I'd installed, and I realized something profound. Melissa had tried to take everything from me, but the one thing she'd never actually owned, could never actually control, was who I was, my worth, my strength, my refusal to be erased. She'd stolen my money, locked me out of my house, forged my signature, drained my accounts, but she'd never owned me, never controlled my future. Never had the power to erase me permanently. Because I wouldn't let her. Because I'd fought back. Because I'd found the truth and held on to it even when everything else was falling apart. Standing inside the house again, I realized the inheritance deed had done more than protect my property. It had exposed the truth about the person I'd trusted most, revealed what she was capable of when she thought she could get away with it, shown me exactly who would stand beside her in betrayal and who would back away when consequences appeared. Melissa thought everything belonged to her, thought she could rewrite ownership through confidence and forged signatures, thought she could take 6 years of my work and make it disappear with a fake document and legal intimidation. She'd planned it carefully, removed evidence, drained accounts, recruited help, celebrated her victory before it was even secure. But she'd forgotten something crucial, something my grandfather had understood when he added those protective clauses to his gift. That property isn't just about deeds and signatures. It's about legacy, about family, about protecting what matters from people who'd take it just because they want it. The one document that saved my future wasn't the forged transfer Melissa had presented. It was the inheritance deed. The protection my grandfather had created years ago without knowing it would one day save his grandson from betrayal. Melissa never owned this house, never owned me, never owned my future. And that truth, preserved in legal archives and protective clauses, had set me free. Not just from her, but from ever letting anyone make me feel powerless again. I'd lost a marriage, lost money, lost time, but I'd gained something more valuable, knowledge of my own strength, and that was something no one could ever take away.